Hi everyone. I wanted to take some time to uh, provide an online presentation for you since we are unable to meet this week. This would be the lecture that I would have given during this week, but we have been snowed in. So I'm hoping to use our online technology in order to keep us up to date with what we are studying. And the emphasis in week 3 is the history of lean production, and tonight's presentation is called How the Automotive Industry Affected the Entire Manufacturing Sector, the History of Lean Manufacturing. I'm going to look at a few different things that your textbook doesn't examine, and the material for this presentation is largely taken from the book titled The Machine That Changed the World by Womack, Jones, and Roos. This book is an older publication. It was published in 1990, but this book is what brought about the concept of lean manufacturing for thousands, if not millions, of people in manufacturing and now in other sectors like healthcare. This book is an historical book, and as you may read in the forward section of the book, the authors say that every organization has to address the 5 elements of a lean business system. Those elements would encompass design of the product, coordination of the supply chain, dealing with the customer, production of the product from order to delivery, and then management of the combined enterprise. We're going to be looking at many of those elements as we study together in Tech 440. So tonight, it's beneficial for us to look at traditional mass production methods and craft production methods and how those compare to lean manufacturing. I think this is a great place for us to begin. This chart shows production strategies from the 1800s until modern day. According to the International Organization of Motor Vehicle Manufacturers, close to 80 million cars were made worldwide in 2011. These numbers are significantly greater than those in 1990, when worldwide production was about 50 million cars per year. Up until recent decades, production has taken the form of mass production. The second chapter of The Machine That Changed the World discusses the rise and fall of mass production, and as you know, mass production is still quite predominant because it's difficult for people to change, but it is being phased out gradually in favor of a more lean method of productivity. As we've talked about in class, a lot of companies are striving to be lean, but perhaps aren't looking at a textbook definition. They're creating their own definition, and we'll talk about that more as we move forward in the class. But mass production is gradually being pushed to the wayside in favor of lean production. The preemptor to mass production was the craft movement that took place in the 1880s. So let's take a closer look at the craft movement and what that entailed. Here is an old photograph that I found several years ago online of an automobile. This automobile was manufactured by Panhard and Levasseur in 1891. And in 1894, P&L was the world's leading car company. In the book, The Machine That Changed the World, the story is told of a man named Evelyn Ellis, who was an English politician at the time. He purchased a car from P&L and was the first person to drive a car in England. And the story goes that he specified exactly how he wanted the car to look, where he wanted the driver's seat to be, and when he picked up the car and drove it, he had his own personal mechanic who would do repairs on the car as he drove it. And so this was definitely a craft product in every way. The characteristics of the craft production era are a highly skilled workforce, hence the craftsman name, and the production volume was low, and every car produced was a prototype, even if it was made from the same plans. The reason for this is that at the time, dimensional creep was a big issue in manufacturing. Dimensional creep just means that the parts creep in their dimensions as something is made and assembled, because they didn't have a couple of things. They didn't have standard gauging of parts, standard measuring methods. They also didn't have hardened steel in order to ensure uniformity. So dimensional creep was an issue, and so every automobile was a prototype. So here are here's a summary of the characteristics of the craft movement, and we had a highly skilled workforce, low production volume. Cost was not an issue. When people initially purchased cars, because that's what we're examining tonight, it was wealthy people who were purchasing automobiles. Your average individual with a average income could not afford them, and so cost wasn't a concern. Remember that Evelyn Ellis specified exactly what he wanted in his car, and he was going to pay for that customization. The craft automobiles were not very reliable, and craftsmen couldn't really pursue innovation because they were working too hard at operating their own job shops, and weren't really looking at new and innovative ways of doing things. Well, nowadays, craft production does occur in automobile manufacturing. The best example would be Aston Martin. This is how one may envision craft production of automobiles, but keep in mind that these are cars that are extremely expensive. I believe these cars can easily cost about $250,000 each, and so you pay for that craftsmanship. Well, here is Henry Ford, and I know that you've all watched the video about his life, and that biography doesn't just give us a picture of who he was as a man and a leader, but it will help you to understand the Highland Park and Rouge manufacturing complexes that he developed as he built the Ford Motor Company. Ford once said, "I will build a car for the great multitude." Oh, sorry, I went ahead, but I'll continue with the Ford quote. He said, "I will build a car for the great multitude. It will be large enough for the family, but small enough for the individual to run and care for. It will be constructed of the best materials by the best men to be hired, after the simplest designs that modern engineering can devise. But it will be low in price, that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one, and enjoy with his family the blessing of hours of pleasure in God's great open spaces." So, needless to say, Ford was successful in accomplishing his goal. Not only this, he changed manufacturing forever as a result of developing the assembly line, measuring to gauge, and the way that he handled labor relations. So now onto this slide that I forwarded to prematurely. Something I didn't catch in the biography piece about Henry Ford is how he actually developed the assembly line. The authors of The Machine That Changed the World fill in the gaps pretty nicely. They talk about the evolution of the assembly line, which began with setting cars on stands and then delivering parts to workers and then moving the workers from station to station, and finally the introduction of the assembly line itself. So it's quite amazing to think about the influence of Henry Ford in manufacturing of all types. And I know from reading your reflection pieces from week 3 that many of you were inspired and learned a lot because of Henry Ford. And he truly is a great American and really changed the future for all of us, but especially those of us who are in manufacturing. Alfred Sloan was at General Motors, and he competed with Ford. And he competed with Henry Ford on 2 different premises. General Motors believed that the enterprise should be managed using new production techniques, and so he was progressive in that kind of way. He also elaborated on Ford's basic product, the Model T, to suit every person purpose. And what Sloan meant by that was that he wanted to get a customer to become a lifelong customer of General Motors. And if you think about GM vehicles, you have different lines from GM all the way up to owning a Cadillac. And so Sloan envisioned having someone buy their first car with him and then gradually step up and buy more expensive cars with more expensive features as they went through life and became more economically stable and able to spend more money. And so he was the one that thought up ideas such as putting features into cars like a radio and add-ons that would make the car more luxurious and more desirable. So I think that's pretty interesting that he took Ford's basic idea and just made it better. So it might be redundant to summarize mass production here because as Americans, this is what we are all familiar with. We tend to embrace this more is better mentality, which is not always the case. But regardless, here's a brief rundown on mass production. It was predominant from the early 1900s into the 1980s. Workers were viewed as interchangeable. Many specialty engineers were used. We had this total vertical integration going on, particularly at the Ford Motor Company. The cost of production really decreased, though, when you compare it to craft production, and quality and reliability improved. One of the big downfalls here is that workers were not responsible for improvements. A guy was responsible for adding a widget to the car or tightening a nut or whatever it was, and that was his job. He wasn't responsible for suggesting improvements. That was somebody else's role. And another aspect of mass production was that the products were essentially identical. They weren't customized to a very great extent. The saying goes that necessity is the mother of invention, and that was definitely the case when E.G. Toyota returned to Nagoya, Japan after visiting Ford's Rouge facility in 1950. Remember that Ford dedicated single machines to pressing pieces of sheet metal, to stamping parts, and to other manufacturing processes. This required the space that was afforded by the Rouge facility, which was roughly 16 million square feet. Toyota needed to make a variety of vehicles in one facility as well. Finally, the workforce in Japan was markedly different from the American workforce. Workers had strong negotiating rights. They weren't willing to be treated as interchangeable parts, and there were no foreign workers allowed in post-war Japanese factories. So Toyota was working within a set of limitations that were absent for Ford, and so he just couldn't do things the same way. So all of these elements added up to an equation for a different kind of manufacturing facility and a different manufacturing strategy. And so Toyota and Ono, when they went back to Japan, they had to work out a new way of doing things, and that new way ended up being the Toyota production system. Taichi Ono was the chief production engineer for Toyota and developed many of the tools of the Toyota production system that we are now familiar with. The first tool described by the authors is single-minute exchange of die, also called quick changeover. This concept let Toyota make small batches of specific parts at a low cost. So this method of manufacturing things was counterintuitive to mass producers who embraced economies of scale, that more is better mentality. Toyota proved the quality could be better and costs could be lower by making small quantities. Other Toyota developed tools like the concept of Kaizen and stopping the production line are described in our text, and we're going to talk about those in the upcoming weeks. Toyota also made an historic agreement with its workers. They guaranteed lifetime employment, they secured housing, and had other unprecedented benefits as part of um, rebuilding production in Japan. But the agreement was not one sided. The employees agreed to promote the interests of the company and to suggest improvements. They agreed to be flexible in their work assignments. So these two elements of Toyota's development in the 1950s, that is, using lean tools and then practicing respect for the individual worker, laid the foundation for the Toyota production system as it came to be known. We'll delve into all of these aspects of Toyota's way of doing things as the semester progresses. So the lean production movement began in post-World War II Japan. The workers are valued and empowered. It seems to take the best characteristics of craft and mass production movements. So items can be customized like in the craft movement, but the cost of products is still low because of the elimination of waste, referred to as muda. The focus is on continuous improvement, and really there is no finish line. That continuous improvement should be continuing indefinitely as long as the company is in existence. And so it requires a long range focus and a long term way of thinking that really isn't very popular in our society today. One of the prominent authors of Toyota and the Toyota production system is Dr. Jeffrey Liker, and he says it took Toyota decades of creating a lean culture to get to where they are, and they still believe they are just learning to understand the Toyota way. What percent of companies outside of Toyota and their close-knit group of suppliers can get an A or even a B plus on lean? I cannot say precisely, but it is far less than 1%. So lean is a balance. As we'll talk about in this class, it's a balance between a lean culture, respect for people, and then tools and techniques that make lean manufacturing possible. You have to have both of these elements or you do not have lean. And so we will talk about all of that as we journey together throughout the semester.